I have played a ludicrous amount of video games, 195 to be exact. So as a person heavily invested in playing video games, I really feel like my pastime is being threatened, since games are being made more and more like the songs in the music industry. Yes, there are different large franchises and genres, but those games are boring to play, and furthermore, the games made by the big publishers known as the AAA feel uninspired and repetitive. Their stories have no impact whatsoever. And finally, their factory-like production forces all of the creativity out of their games. In other words, the high-budget games feel boring to play, their stories are uninspired, and small studios do a better job of making fun and captivating games. First, let's start with the three top giants in the world of AAA publishers: Call of Duty, Far Cry, and Assassin's Creed. These franchises have run their courses long ago, so let's start with Call of Duty and one of its recent releases, Infinite Warfare, a game that feels remarkably boring. Having a minimum amount of alterations from previous titles, this game fails to feel fresh, having the exact same gameplay loop. For example, the standard formula is the following. You are an American super soldier with enough guns to invade a small Middle Eastern country, and so you do, mowing down foreigners faster than the meat grinders of World War I. Next we have Far Cry, which deviates from Call of Duty's formula by having an open world, which means it takes longer to get to places. Even though it's an open world, the last installment produced this reaction. Far Cry New Dawn is a weak effort. It's short, forgettable, and repetitive. In the Far Cry games, you go through the effort of liberating small countries, which means switching from one dictator to another. This usually requires climbing some form of tower to scout the enemy compound and then infiltrating it stealthily. Later, you get noticed and end up just shooting everyone until you are the last man standing. Having such a large map of 64 square kilometers makes it a chore to go from one compound to another, then climb the same tower and over again. This formula is as repetitive as the last and even more tedious. Finally, we have Assassin's Creed, a franchise with 12 installments that will probably never stop being produced. Assassin's Creed is centered around killing people in different historical settings such as Victorian London or ancient Egypt. Speaking of ancient Egypt, a recent game, Assassin's Creed Odyssey, received this reaction. Odyssey feels less like a fun game and more like a slog. Such a review is not surprising since all 12 games in the franchise follow the same formula as Far Cry, but without guns and with more stabbing. In conclusion, all three franchises, Call of Duty, Far Cry, and Assassin's Creed, have long and repetitive gameplay loops consisting of going to a place and killing anyone there, and nothing else. This makes it a tiresome experience to play. Second, the three franchises mentioned previously are quite uninspired. Their stories are on the level of high school writing with the most obvious of twists. In fact, small companies or even individuals create better stories and enriched worlds. Let's start with how uninspired AAA games really are. The current crop have lacked creativity and inspiration, with the emphasis on grind and meaningless loot. A large part of the issue is how these games started becoming longer and more drawn out, in order to justify buying extra boosts or loot boxes, which is a cheap tactic to make some more money. This also makes all aspects of the game feel more repetitive and uninspired, since you have to visit most of the interesting set pieces over and over again, killing any intrigue they might have had. For example, if you were to visit a temple full of religious fanatics shrouded in mystery, it would kill any interest if you started passing by every day, perhaps stopping for some small talk with tea and biscuits. Second, the story that should be the driving force for you to endure this repetitive hell has been stitched together from the corpses of better games. As Ferreira said, developers should be doing their best to make sure that it doesn't overuse tropes, characters are well defined, and that the plot isn't at all confusing. A recent example would be Dying Light, which is a zombie game. Not only that, but this game could not stop telling me that I need to find another MacGuffin to solve the story, killing any interest I had in the game. I didn't even finish it. Ironically, many small companies or even individuals managed to craft some inspired worlds and stories. I mean, the amazing story, the amazing soundtrack, the amazing visuals, and the amazing overall game. Sure, most indie games are really bad. They're filled with bugs, poor writing, bad visuals, poor gameplay, and the total lack of polish. Fortunately, their being so plentiful makes it a competitive market, encouraging the creation of interesting and thoughtful games rather than the time grinders like the AAA titles. Indie games manage to be both the best and the worst. They create an environment where mediocrity is non existent and creativity is the norm. In conclusion, smaller developers manage to create better games and touching stories, while the AAA's lack of ingenuity and awful writing suggests the need for change in the industry. Third, AAA games are produced in a factory-like fashion. Many great indie games, though simple, outcompete AAA alternatives, and a study proves smaller teams innovate more often. Let's begin with how the factory system ensures the death of creativity. According to Ubisoft's website, they released 6 games in 2019, and EA's website says they have manufactured 14. This is quite impressive, considering most games take up to 5 years to make. Although, this makes sense if we consider the hundreds of employees, pre-existing assets, and the few stories they actually have to develop. To meet this reasonable demand of 6 to 14 games a year, corners have to be cut, and the easiest way to cut spendings is to not wait for someone to come up with an interesting idea. Let's compare two games, Dead Space 3 and Darkwood. Both are horror games, or at least are supposed to be. Dead Space 3 fails to understand that horror is personal. Horror works best when it's in small, intimate settings, when we can project ourselves into the protagonist's boots. We may be impressed by the spectacle of a sequel's larger scope, but it's harder to care. Its horror fails since in the first 5 minutes you see the monsters running around and barely noticing you. This makes the game lose its potential horror, especially since the monsters are easy to see and outrun, making them no threat to the player. In Darkwood, on the other hand, you don't see much at first. All of the imagery is saved for later. The game also uses effective pacing to ensure the players tense throughout. You never get a full glimpse of what the actual horror in the spooky Polish forest is. All you see are the things it causes. A village of swine worshippers, a friendly wolfman selling guns and supplies, deranged tribesmen, and buildings covered in a weird organic matter, the origin of which you don't know. Every night could be your last. As you fuel up the generator and barricade the doors, you pray nothing sees you or tries to come inside. You see and hear things, a door creaking, something in the shadows, as you start thinking if it's wise to stand your ground or run away. While you are listening to every sound, the music builds. You begin to realize there is no escape. You've blocked every other entrance to ensure your safety, and even if you were to go outside in the dark, you would never know what is lurking just outside the fence. Such tense gameplay reinforces the experience. You understand the struggle of everybody else in the story, either hiding in the village, trusting the elders, or out on their own in the dense woods. The story really does get across, even though it's quite cryptic. It also gets across a lot better than the tone-deaf explosions and action scenes in Dead Space 3. This is not shocking, seeing that the studio who developed it is Visceral Games, a studio which had almost 100 people working on Dead Space 3, while Darkwood only had 3 friends from Poland surviving off donations. Although it's not surprising, a new analysis of more than 65 million papers, patents, and software projects found that smaller teams produce much more disruptive and innovative research than larger teams, which more often develop and consolidate existing knowledge. It is easy to apply these results to developers, since they also research new concepts and ideas. There's a strong parallel. Small studios make new ideas while AAA does them to death, finding every little trick to make the core gameplay as enjoyable as can be. In brief, AAA studios are factories, producing refined products. This product may not be the vision of an artist, unlike the games made by small developers such as the people behind Darkwood. In conclusion, many of the AAA's franchises are bland and boring to play. Most are uninspired, and AAA's factory model gets beaten by tiny studios with shoestring budgets, which actually makes sense. First, the 3 top franchises, Call of Duty, Far Cry, and Assassin's Creed, have more than 10 installments each. Just this makes it hard for them to be original. Second, these franchises feel uninspired, with quick, patchy writing and story, which is easily outdone by indie developers. Third, AAA's incentive to produce games in a factory fashion hurts their individuality, making it possible for indie games to outdo them in genres focused on individuality, such as horror. In summary, AAAs consisting of large companies with many employees producing the same games yearly was bound to become stale, and small studios were bound to outdo them.